Trump wasted no time following yesterday's terror attack in New York City. Initially talking about how this was proof that we need to stop people from the Middle East coming into our country. Then an aide explained that Uzbekistan is not in fact actually in the Middle East. And so he backed off a little bit and talked more generally about how extreme vetting needs to be stepped up, saying that being politically correct is fine, but not for this. I'm assuming that's sarcasm there at the end, because he doesn't think it's fine. And so then the morning came, and he got his daily intelligence briefing from Fox and Friends, and they told him about this program, the Diversity Visa Lottery Program. And they talked about it in depth, especially the diversity part, for reasons you might be able to guess. Here is a little mashup.
As you've stated clearly, the diversity program on the visas has got to be shut down.
Talk a little bit about the diversity visa program, diversity visa lottery.
The fact that we would have a diversity program open to allow people to come in, it's insane.
Chuck Schumer attached to the immigration bill back in 1990. It has been suggested that Chuck Schumer, now a U.S. Senator, was one of the sponsors.
Lebanon is where you're from, right?
Yes, that's right.
They are part of the visa lottery program.
The diversity visa program, the reason this was even established is to offer to countries with low rates of immigration into the United States.
Lottery system, I've always been against it because it's a random system to bring people into the United States. It's not merit-based.
His diversity visa proposal, also known as the green card lottery.
Is it time to really get both Democrats and Republicans to end this program today?
How much more diversity do you want?
And we got to make sure that we are doing the vetting, and that's what's failed. We've failed to vet people.
Calling for higher vetting in high threat areas. And eventually the travel ban came out of that.
The president last night, Dan, suggested we needed more super vetting, essentially. Is he right?
To abolish this program and put a merit-based system into the United States.
What do we need? A diversity program on visas.
Diversity visa program.
Vetting is the answer.
The president also has tweeted out about how we need better vetting, extreme vetting. He's right about that, isn't he?
There will be a component of vetting. Should it be lottery? Should it be even normal visa?
When you go overseas and you hear about vetting, don't for a second think you're walking into the Syrian Department of Motor Vehicles and getting a list of parking tickets this person's got for 15 years.
I don't know why we even have this anymore, considering the fact that one of the 9/11 pilots applied for this twice.
So what is missing is basically this one program of vetting.
Vetting what? What are you going to ask for a library card in Uzbekistan?
Well, I think there are a lot of people who now are learning about the diversity visa program. They don't like it.
How about a United States first immigration program?
The previous administration did not choose to have vetting.
Get rid of the visa, this lottery program.
So would a United States first immigration program prioritize people coming here from the United States?
Okay, so let's break down all the absurdities. First, I want to go back to what John said, which was really funny. He's like, Uzbekistan, that's the problem with the Middle East. It's in Central Asia, idiot. I mean, that's the problem with the Central Asian republics that are part of Russia's sphere of influence. Wait, no, I meant Uzbekistan is great. Except for the Muslims, they're almost all Muslim. Well, okay, they're bad, but somehow they're associated with Putin, so I might have to retract these comments later. Okay, so then we go to the green card lottery. Now, it's not really true that Schumer was necessarily in favor of the green card lottery. We'll get into that. Okay, but I am. I think the green card lottery is fantastic.
How much more diversity do you want? By the way, an angry man screaming, how much more diversity do you want, is peak Fox News.
That's right. And actually, and of course, getting minorities to do it is also Fox News 101. We have brought a Lebanese guy. He looks like and he speaks like he's from the Middle East. In reality, of course, he's paid by think tanks and other organizations to sell out everyone who looks and speaks like him. And so we brought this shill here to speak out against everyone else from his neck of the woods. Now, if we'd of course killed the diversity program before his ass got in here, he'd be in the middle of Beirut somewhere. But since he's already made it, he'd like to burn the bridge down right after him, because that's the kind of people that Fox News loves, right? And then we'll get an African-American guy on here, go, what kind of diversity do we need? Yeah. I already got paid by Fox News. I'm counting the cash. I don't need any more diversity. I already got paid. Okay, that's very nice for you. You must be so goddamn proud. Now let's go to the substance here of, I thought we weren't politicizing tragedies. So this comes as a giant shock to me, because I remember this 8 people were killed here. That is, and we talked about it yesterday. I got friends in New York. It scared me half to death because the kids were attacked and they've got kids, etc. So now in Vegas, though, we had 59 people killed. We had over 500 people that were injured, 600 people shot overall. But don't politicize. Don't politicize.
I don't know what you're talking about. I mean, Sarah Huckabee Sanders addressed this today. Let's watch.
In the hours, in fact the days after the horrific shooting in Las Vegas, the president repeatedly said, now is not the time to talk about policy. Now is not the time to talk about politics. That's for another time. Right now we need to mourn the dead. Yet this morning the president launched into a political argument with Senator Chuck Schumer on Twitter, literally hours after this incident yesterday. Why was he so quick to go the political route and point fingers at Chuck Schumer for the fact that this person was in the country at all?
Well, look, this wasn't about going the political route. This is something that, frankly, the president's been talking about for a long time. This isn't a new policy. This isn't a new position. This isn't a new conversation. The president has been talking about extreme vetting and the need for that for the purpose of protecting the citizens of this country since he was a candidate, long before he was ever president. This isn't a new argument, this isn't a new position, and this wasn't new for the president to speak about it.
Okay, good. So you can have immunity to not politicize things so long as you talked about the issue before the attack. So thankfully, we've been talking about gun control here for any number of years, so we're free. We have the immunity idol.
Yes. What, gun control was new after Vegas, apparently. Nobody was talking about it before. And right after Vegas, some scoundrels tried to talk about it. And then, of course, the Republicans had thoughts and prayers that are really, really important. And the only thing you should do after a tragedy, all of a sudden, no thoughts and prayers here, nothing but complete political action.
But hold on, so there, she doesn't actually define really why it's different between the Vegas response and this, but she is going to in this next video. Wait until you see what her rationale is.
I want to follow up on the question John was asking you earlier. You're making the case that these are not new policies he's talking about. And yet the question still remains. He is delving into a policy and political discussion. And he and you were very clear after the Las Vegas shooting that it wasn't appropriate to talk about policy. So what's the difference now?
I said it wasn't appropriate to politicize the conversation, which I don't believe we are. We're talking about protecting American lives.
The president invoked Chuck Schumer's name. So how can you argue that it's not a political argument that he's making?
Look, Senator Schumer has supported these opposing policies, and I think that that is a very basic fact.
Okay, so there's a second rule. So you had to have been talking about it before the attack, and you can only target people who are opposing the things that you think would solve the problem. I think we can find some Republican politicians who that would qualify for gun control. But I am glad to know that in this case, we're talking about saving American lives. Those of you out there who thought that maybe after Vegas, we could at the very least eliminate bump stocks and things like it, whose sole purpose is to allow you to effectively break the law by creating an automatic weapon. That wasn't supposed to save American lives, nothing like that.
30,000 people die every year from guns in America. So you want to talk about saving American lives? And this is what really enrages me about the attention span in this country. Now here, you've got the press doing a pretty good job of holding them accountable on their hypocrisy. And yes, the Vegas shooting certainly got plenty of coverage. But when there's terrorist attacks from right-wingers, it's always a one-off, it's a mentally deranged person, etc. And okay, but when you have an attack by a Muslim person, it's wall to wall. We have to change all the policies. We have to attack all the politicians on the other side. We have to change everything.
Change it today, they said on Fox.
So what I would like is consistency. So what would be the consistent thing to do? First of all, if you want to save and protect American lives, the first thing you should talk about is guns, because that costs 30,000 lives a year. That is 10 9/11s every single year. So if you want to prioritize, that should be your #1 priority. How do we minimize the amount of lives lost from guns, because it is an epidemic of gun violence in this country, okay? So then, secondly, when you go to terrorism, should you discuss this? Of course you should. Should you try to find a way to combat what happened in New York? Of course you should. We all live here. Nobody wants to die, so we should fight terrorism. Now, when you go to fight terrorism, I think there's a good argument to be made on whether you should focus most of your efforts on right-wingers or Muslim radicals. Now, there are more right-wing terrorist attacks in this country than Muslim terrorist attacks by a good number. And you could ask the FBI, Homeland Security, those are actual facts, and there's no question about them. On the other hand, Muslim radicals, unfortunately, are acting at a higher per capita ratio. So it's an interesting debate as to where we should spend our resources. And I would argue both, right? And maybe in equal proportion, even though there's more right-wing attacks. I can understand wanting to concentrate resources on a smaller number of individuals. That doesn't mean you should invade their mosques and houses and schools, but legitimate investigations with warrants, that would be great so that we can stop radicals of all stripes from killing our fellow citizens. So on the issue of politicizing, I might have a controversial opinion, which is no, I think that all of these tragedies are political and we should have political discussions about them immediately. It would be, the Republicans are hypocritical. They say, if it's guns, don't ever talk about it. Wait several weeks or months or years or never, right? But if it's terrorism, we should, well, if it's right-wing terrorism, it's a lone wolf, never discuss it. If it's Muslim terrorism, let's go nuts.
If it's right-wing, say something about mental health, then do nothing about mental health.
That's exactly right.
Then move on.
That's right. Now, whereas we are consistent, if it's guns, you should do something about guns. If it's terrorism, you should do something about terrorism. And you shouldn't wait a week or 2 weeks or a month to talk about it. You should talk about it now. 8 people just died in New York. I keep saying I got friends and family in New York. I don't want anybody to, and it doesn't matter if I don't have any friends or family. The right-wing terrorists who killed people attacking a Jewish community center in the middle of Kansas. I don't know anybody in Kansas, but I don't want that happening. And we should talk about it right afterwards.
Well, and certainly if you're gonna say that your president is the guy who tells it like it is, but then when he actually tells it like it is, or at least he's politicizing it, that's what he's doing, you then say that he's not doing that, when in fact he's as politicizing it as you can. Like you can politicize something as in, a shooting just happened, I'd say in general we need gun control. That's like level 1. Level 2 would be saying here's a specific law that we should pass. Level 3 is attacking a particular politician for a vote he made decades ago. There's no more political than that, but he won't actually own up to it. And as you said, there are these different types of terrorists. Now what's interesting about this is their response isn't just political, that's not the problem with it, it's that it's nonsensical. Stopping that program wouldn't have stopped this guy because there's no evidence that this guy radicalized before coming here. The extreme vetting that you want isn't gonna catch many of these people because they're not radicals when they come over here, they're radicalized in the United States. And that's not just true for people who are Muslim, that's true for the right-wingers as well. Obviously, they grow up here, they're radicalized here, and then they go in and shoot up a theater or a casino or whatever here. So what you have to do is track down, you have to stop the radicalization if you can, and if not, you need to investigate it here. And so what would you need to do that? You would need to fund programs that do that here. But not only are they not increasing funding of those programs, as we've reported throughout the year, they've in fact pulled funds from that for the exact sort of programs that would stop the Vegas shooting and things of that nature. That's what you need. Not to just have some stupid emotional knee-jerk anti-immigrant response to every time a single person is killed in this country.
And that Lebanese guy on Fox News claimed that the last administration did no vetting at all. What a preposterous lie. We have the toughest vetting process in the entire world. It takes 18 months for a refugee to get through our vetting process, literally the longest in the world. And that was true under Obama, Bush, etc. So for them to claim that we're not doing vetting is preposterous.
And ask yourself if you want to put a guy in charge of extreme vetting who allowed a guy to be his campaign chairman, who is beholden to Russian and Ukrainian oligarchs and has broken any number of federal laws, and all of this just flew over our very wise president's head.
Yeah, all of a sudden when it comes to you, no vetting at all.
No.
Oh, well, how could I know that all these different guys working for me were tied to Putin and the Russians? There's no way of knowing. I love extreme vetting. Oops. Help us build independent media together. Come join us, tytnetwork.com/join.